Works for you.
Are you ready, sir?
All right. Good morning. Welcome to the 2020 Alan M. Boyden Memorial Lectureship. I'm Kevin Dirksen, Senior Ethicist and Director of Ethics Education at the Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics. This is our first lectureship of 2020, and we're so excited to be celebrating 20 years of service in healthcare. Thanks so much for those of you who continue to support our work now and into the future. It's my job to stand between you and figuring out how to pronounce the French word in the title this morning, so I'll try to be quick with a few announcements. If you haven't done so already, please silence your cell phones and pagers. Medical grand rounds will go until 9 o'clock, including some time at the end of the hour for questions. We'll then pause, allow for those of you who need to leave and go do patient care matters to do so before we transition into an extended Q&A until 9:30. This presentation is being recorded. For those of you who don't know Dr. Boyden, he was a surgeon here at Providence St. Vincent for nearly 5 decades. A well-respected leader by his colleagues, it is said that one of his greatest attributes as a physician was an ability to find wholeness in the doctor-patient relationship. I'd like to acknowledge that we have Bradley Boyden with us today, Dr. Boyden's son. Thank you for being here. And Alan for being here as well. Thank you very much. This lectureship promotes excellence in patient care by connecting medicine with the humanities and is made possible by generous contributions of our supporters through the Providence St. Vincent Medical Foundation. More information on this lectureship can be found in your handout. And now it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Torree McGowan. Torree McGowan is a board-certified emergency physician and a fellow of the American College of Emergency Physicians. She served in the United States Air Force as an emergency physician and medical director for soldiers in combat, having deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. She remains an active U.S. Air Force reservist while holding down her day job as an attending physician in emergency medicine with St. Charles Medical Group in Bend. Dr. McGowan's interests include physician wellness, disaster medicine, trauma, and occasionally challenging the vocabulary of clinicians and ethicists alike. Her work in narrative medicine has been featured in the New England Journal of Medicine and other publications. But most importantly, Dr. McGowan is one of our colleagues, someone from our community here in Oregon, who we've asked to share her perspective with us on how what ails the healing professions might just be countered in part with the meaning inherent in the work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Torree McGowan.
Thank you all. Before I get going, everyone on the side, please come grab a chair, and it will not bother me if you have to sneak out in the middle. I was a resident too. I'll never forget Raul. He came through my trauma bay in Bagram, and he had what, in the middle of that mass casualty event, was really just a minor injury. Back here in the United States, this would be the type of injury that an emergency physician would see once in a career. IED blast, gun battle, hand amputation. But there, it was just a minor injury, a footnote. And so he waited patiently while the rest of his comrades filed through my trauma bay with their open book pelvis fractures and their blast lungs and went off to the operating room. And finally, it was his turn. And I walked up and I introduced myself like I do to all my patients. I said, hey, this is Doc McGowan here in the Air Force Hospital at Bagram. You're safe. What's your name? And he looked up at me and he said, Raul. Doc, is my hand gone? And I looked down and I saw his forearm that ended in a bandage about mid-shaft. And I said, yeah, it is. I'm sorry. And I met his eyes that were filled with unshed tears. And he said, Doc, how am I going to hold my little girl's hand? She's only 2. She won't understand. And I rolled through the rest of my trauma assessment, and we talked about the advances in prosthetics and the incredible resiliency of toddlers. And when it was time for him to file out of my trauma bay and off to his next stop, I grabbed onto his left hand. And I said, you tell her to hold on to this one. You saved it for her. That was the last time I saw Raul, and he got swept up into that vast machinery of medicine at war. And I wonder now, his daughter would be about 9, just a little bit younger than my son. I wonder what she grew to think of his hand. And I wonder if she still holds his hand. Storytelling has been going on longer than recorded history. It comes in many forms: written word, art, petroglyphs, cave paintings, music, dance, Twitter, Instagram. All of these are ways to create a connection between one human and another to make sure that our experience on this earth does not end with us. If you ask my brother, he can tell you how to write a story. So he's a high school English teacher, and he specializes in teaching people how to create these tales. He'll tell you about a character and a plot and a setting. He'll tell you to write a strong opening and to build that action and to create a conflict. He might show you something that looks like this. This is Freytag's Pyramid. Gustav Freytag was an 18th century German playwright who created this schema for writing dramatic works. The setting, the characters are introduced in the exposition. You create the conflict and you build the action through the rising action. The greatest conflict comes at the climax, and then the resolution happens as the conflict is resolved, and the story ends with the denouement. But the problem in medicine is our stories and our patients' stories run parallel for so many years, and then they only intersect for minutes or hours. What happens when we don't know the end of those stories? What toll does that take on us? We jump in somewhere in the middle of the rising action. Something has already started, and they have to tell us what's happened. And we're there just for that climax. And then we send them off to the next step in care, especially in emergency medicine, before we have an answer. Our story just ends, and theirs continues, and we don't get the answer to that a lot of times in emergency medicine. This leaves me wondering and searching for an ending. And sometimes we go through the charts and look and see if we can find. But that isn't the story. That isn't what actually happened to the patient. And in my mind, those jumbled pieces of a plot beg to be sorted out. How do we say goodbye to a patient or tell them what we hope for them, help celebrate those victories or mourn those losses when we don't know what happens? One of the byproducts of the increase in technology in medicine is we have gotten further and further away from the story of our patients. It's created an ethical challenge for many physicians. I don't know about you, but when I was playing with my Fisher-Price stethoscope, it didn't have a laptop to make sure that I could document accurately what I did to my teddy bears. This is not why we went into medicine, for that thrilling charting. But that's what separates us from our patients, more and more. Computers have separated us from the people that we take care of more every single day. This story was published in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine. It's estimated that an emergency physician on an average 10-hour shift will click a mouse 4,000 times. Over half of our time in medicine is now spent on charting and paperwork, with less than a third of it being taken care of in actual patient care. It's been easy to ignore the cost that this technology has exacted from us. And don't get me wrong, there are good things about the EMRs. It's really nice to be able to read the handwriting. It's nice to be able to find a chart that it's not missing somewhere. But we haven't talked at all about the unintended consequences of this technologic takeover of medicine. And I often wonder, what is our role as caregivers in trying to claw back that patient-physician relationship out of those electrons in the computer and back into our exam rooms where we actually take care of people? Medicine continues to try to force us to be more like a business and to meet metrics. And how does that actually impact what we do to take care of patients? Patients are voting loud and clear. The most important thing that they want is time with us. and time to talk to us. And they are increasingly turning to alternative therapies and pseudoscience. And when you ask them, why do you go to these? They say, because they listen to me and they take time with me. That's something that we're failing. So how did we get here? Or more importantly, how do we get back to where patients and their stories are the center of our care? How do we put a face behind that faceless white coat that they see? We might do it by listening to their stories better and maybe learning to tell a little bit of our own. Like everything in medicine, learning to tell a story is a journey. And I don't know about you guys, but I remember the very first time I had to dictate a history and physical for a chart. I was on my rural rotation in Burns, so I'm an OHSU graduate, and I was out in Burns, and I was first call in the emergency room. And my attending asked me to dictate the chart, and I gave it a try. In my mind, I said something like this: 4-year-old male presents to the emergency department along with mom with a complaint of cough and difficulty breathing. Mom states that the child has had a runny nose throughout the day and then developed a harsh cough this evening. She also noted difficulty breathing. He's been afebrile and able to eat and drink well. No known sick contacts. So this was back in the day that somebody actually listened and typed out what you said, not the dragon. This is actually what she brought back to me. So she gave me 2 versions, an edited version and the unedited version. And I love this because it's part of learning how to tell that story. Now I actually know how to do that fairly well, and I can create a narrative that all of us will recognize as croup. But that's a skill that we are losing in medicine. So now that we talk about these history of present illnesses and we take that history, now we have to translate it into click boxes in an EMR. We have to figure out where to put the duration and the severity and the onset and the palliation and provoking so that someone who's non-medical can count that up and give us our 99215. Our EMRs are really good at this. They help us do this with templates and prompts and review of systems that do absolutely nothing to help with the care of the patient, but help the bottom line instead. One of the things that we struggle with in medicine, one of our great questions, is how do we balance the importance of being able to bill and keep our doors open so that we can serve patients with not making medicine so routine and robotic that our patients are completely disenfranchised and not willing to participate. Medicine is also very beholden to time measures, especially in emergency medicine. The corporate pressures of getting through patients and getting to see them make it really hard to wait for patients to tell their stories. Now, I'm an emergency physician and I have no attention span to begin with and no patience. And so whenever a patient comes in to me and says, well, 10 years ago, I want to say stop. Obviously, anything that started 10 years ago has not killed you yet. How did that result in an emergency department visit today? But unfortunately, I'm not the narrator of this story. I don't get to set that exposition. I have to wait and let them tell their story in the emergency room. I will never forget picking up a chart when I was stationed in California, chief complaint of shoulder pain. And I walked into the room and I found an elderly African-American gentleman sitting there. And I introduced myself and I said, what brings you in to see me today? And he said, well, I hurt my shoulder at Pearl Harbor and it's been bothering me ever since. I said, have you been on vacation to Hawaii recently? Or are we talking about when the Japanese bombed it? And he said, no, it was back in World War II. He told me the story about being a cook on a destroyer. And when the Japanese attacked, he went up and onto the deck and started loading ammunition because so many of his colleagues were killed. And he talked about a bomb going off and falling and landing on that shoulder. And the pain that he'd carried with him for 3/4 of a century. He'd never discussed it with any of his physicians. And I said, why today? Why did this come to the emergency room today? And he said, well, I was down at the VFW and my buddies mentioned that I should probably get it looked at. I said, okay, sounds reasonable. we examined him, and I diagnosed his arthritis, and we talked about follow-up through the VA. And then I said, but tell me about being at Pearl Harbor. And got to sit there and listen to the most amazing story, you know, the things that we make movies about. This is the type of thing that keeps me coming back for more. These are the stories that are the wheat among the chaff that create meaning for me in my practice. In medicine, we really talk about medical writing as being journals and research articles and textbooks. We are starting to understand that the story is also important, that narrative medicine can also be useful and important to tell in medicine. One of the reasons that story is so important in community is actually really nicely described in an article in Nature Communications. So they looked at a tribe called the Agta tribe in the Philippines. They're a tribe of hunter-gatherers. And they went to these different villages and they asked people, who are the best storytellers in your tribe? And they could name as many storytellers as they wanted per tribe. And what they found was villages that named more storytellers, more people who could tell a good story, tended to be more cooperative. At the end of asking about their storytellers, they gave the participants rice and said, you can share this with your village if you would like. What they found is in villages with good storytellers, more rice was shared with the entire community. Even more rice was shared with the people who could tell a good story, but the entire village benefited. And the researchers suggested that this was because good storytelling increases a community. It teaches us how to behave and teaches us the traditions of a community and builds those bonds more strongly. They then asked about, who would you like to live with in this community? And they could name anybody. And then they broke it down on what are the characteristics of those people. Good storytellers were the most popular people to want to live with, even more so than someone you were related to. A good hunter or gatherer, or someone with medical knowledge. Someone who could tell a good story around the campfire was more valuable to these people than someone who could feed you or save your life. Good storytellers were also statistically more likely to have living children than others in their village, 0.5 more living children per good storyteller. The researchers postulated that this might be because they got more resources and received more social support when they needed it. My thought is maybe they're just better at talking people into bed. I don't know. Neuroscience can also help us understand why storytelling is so important. So when I put a PowerPoint up here and I start putting up bullets, you read those, and Broca's area turns on, and Wernicke's area turns on. And that's it. And oh, by the way, if I show you a bunch of slides with a lot of words on them, you stop listening to me. You ever notice that? You can't read and listen at the same time. So for those of you who are reading about Broca's and Wernicke's areas there, you have no idea what I just said. But if I tell you a story, so much more starts to happen in our brains. When I describe to you how you can tell a serious head wound by that slightly salty smell of the CSF, your olfactory bulb lights up. When I talk to you about holding Raoul's hand, your sensory cortex on your left hand lit up. And when I talked about squeezing his hand, your motor cortex fired. The neuroscientists tell us these are called mirror neurons, and they help us experience stories just like the person who's telling us. And so what does that mean for medicine? They suggest that mirror neurons are the basis of empathy. They help us understand what someone else is going through. And so when we take a history and physical, we hear some of the most horrific stories of trauma and fear and illness. And we experience those. We don't just click boxes. What happens to our brains if we don't know the end of that story? If it just stops and we don't know the next piece of that? The very first time I started to think about how important it is to not have an ending to patient stories was when I was deployed to Iraq. While I was there were several groups that came through with what's called Operation Proper Exit. So this is a cooperation between the USO and the Wounded Warrior Project. and they would take wounded soldiers and bring them back to where they'd been injured. These were gentlemen that were farther along in their rehab, so they'd usually been injured a few years before, and they got to go back and see where they'd been injured. Because most of these men, the last thing that they remembered, and most of them were men, the last thing they remembered was getting hit. And then they would wake up 3 weeks later at Brooke Army Medical Center or Walter Reed. And so they lost that entire climax of their story. Some of the most important and transformative experiences of their life, they didn't get to have. And so they brought them back and showed them where they were injured. And they brought them through the evacuation chain and showed them the Army evac crews that brought them to the hospital and brought them through the trauma base where they were stabilized and the ORs where they were worked on. They got to meet the CCAT teams, the critical care air transport teams that took them from theater back to Landstuhl in Germany and then back on home. When they came through Balad, where I was stationed, every time they would just set out chairs in our trauma bay and they would tell stories about their lives. I remember there were 2 gentlemen who were in the same unit at the same time and were hit by an IED when they were on patrol. And so the dismounted IED injury is a very classic injury in trauma now that has very well described injury patterns. When you are walking and there's an IED that goes off, bilateral lower extremity amputations are very common, and you often get a lot of groin injuries too. This is very well known amongst our soldiers. And so these gentlemen talked about the IED going off, and they were right next to each other. They talked about crawling across the ground to get to each other, and then making the other guy look and make sure their testicles were still intact. They told stories about rehab and having babies and getting married and life going on. And they said something that was so important to me. I didn't even know this was an important question that I had until they answered it for me. Every one of them said, "Thank you for saving me. You saved me for a good life." These weren't the same men that I took care of, but they were the same injuries and the same worries. And you worry, especially when you're taking care of a triple amputee with blast lung and a massive head injury. You wonder, will you be glad that I did this? Or would you have wished that I didn't try quite so hard? That I would have just let you go? Every single one said that they were grateful for the life that they had been given. And that was a transformative moment, not just for my deployment, but for me as a physician, to know that I was doing something that was worthwhile for that patient. These brief moments in the timeline of these patients' stories are so outsized in their impact on their life. I only have patients for a few minutes or hours in the emergency room. My job is to stabilize them and send them off to the next step so that someone else can do the fine-tuning and the rehab. If I do my job right, they're only with me for minutes or hours because time is the hallmark of my success. We hear it in emergency medicine all the time. Time is muscle, time is brain, time is my job. But what happens when we ship you off to that next step without knowing? This was often the last time I would see a patient. So this was them rolling out of my trauma bay to the CT scanner. And they would be swept up into the vast machinery of medicine at war. And I would never know what happened to them. What toll does that take when we don't know what happens to our patients? And when we can't tell them all of our hopes and dreams and the things that we wish for them? I think that this is part of the very complicated course of compassion fatigue. In emergency medicine, there are some estimates that put burnout at 67%. And we all know these statistics. How do we start to address that in medicine? It's been called many different things throughout history. So in medicine, we call it burnout, also have been called compassion fatigue. The first descriptions of post-traumatic stress disorder were in the Civil War in the United States. They called it soldier's heart or nostalgia. Nostalgia was if they found men crying and wanting to go home in the middle of the night. Soldier's heart was just used to describe the palpitations and the nausea and the sweating, the physical symptoms. They treated it with digitalis or morphine. In World War I, that evolved to combat fatigue or shell shock. The first Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, or DSM, was published in 1952, and it described what they called a gross stress reaction. It assumed that all of your symptoms would be gone in 6 months. This evolved in the DSM-2 to what was called adjustment disorder to adult life. There were only 3 conditions that you could have for adjustment or disorder: suicidal thoughts associated with an unwanted pregnancy, fear associated with military combat, and Gassner syndrome. Gassner syndrome was a syndrome that was characterized by incorrect answers to questions for people that were facing a death penalty on the stand. It wasn't until 1980, with the publishing of the DSM-3, that they actually had post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis available for physicians to use. The definition in 1980 required a life-threatening situation where you were in fear for your life. But we found that that really didn't cover a lot of people. How was it that people would come back from war who had never been in one of these situations but still had symptoms like PTSD? How can physicians have symptoms so eerily similar to PTSD when we are not the ones who are doing the dying? There's obviously something missing. Litz and his colleagues published in 2009 in Clinical Psychology Review a paper that defined this condition, the moral injury. And they described it as events that happen that are so morally against your deeply held beliefs that they cut to your very soul. In war, the moral injuries tend to center around the killing of a combatant, or even worse, the killing of a civilian. It's walking away without a scratch when your buddy died right next to you. In medicine, our moral injuries are discharging a patient that you know can't afford their medicine and will die without it. It's submitting pre-authorization after pre-authorization to fight for a basic need for a patient and have it rejected because one word was wrong on a form. It's saving a life, but knowing that life is full of pain and worry and sorrow. How do we reconcile those moral injuries? We went into medicine to care for people, not to improve someone's bottom line. And how do we treat that moral injury? The problem is, when we hear a history in physical and when we participate in someone's care, we're not just passive observers. Our mirror neurons say that we can't be. We grieve, we struggle, and we carry that with us. And in medicine, we don't get to leave our battlefields behind. We don't get to come home. We go back the next night and do another shift. How is it that we are able to continue doing that? As physicians, we're the ones who are the experts in the type of repeated trauma that leads to PTSD. We do the studies, we publish the symptoms and the treatments, but we don't apply that to our own workplaces. If I told you that there was a industry that had 70% of patients or 70% of people affected by that industry with symptoms consistent with a disease, we would demand, we need to look at your schedules, we need to look for toxins, we need to figure out what is making people so sick. Only in medicine do we say, the canaries in the coal mine, we just need a tougher canary. Or maybe we should just teach them how to do some yoga. And so in the next 10 years, the job of the people in this room are to start demanding these types of answers from our people. We have to start looking at burnout as an occupational hazard. And how do we start taking care of those occupational, those environmental factors that are leading to it? Or else when I'm old, there's not going to be anyone to take care of me. And I worry about that. There are some great places that are starting to look at these systems, but honestly, a lot of that intervention still revolves around making that canary stronger. And until we have good systems to fix those environments, we have to find ways to deal with that ourselves. And the way that I've dealt with that is through writing. This type of storytelling helps me deal with those things that I can't say to patients. There are so many words that I want to say that I don't get to say out loud. And because of that conflict, I've started to write them. Many of you have gotten this type of a phone call, or you will sometime in your career. This is my cousin Jerry. About 8 years ago, I got a phone call. I was still stationed in California. In 33 years of my life, my cousin Jerry had never called me. And he said, "My eyes and my skin are yellow. Should I be worried?" And I prayed for yeses to my next questions. I said, "Does it hurt? Have you been vomiting?" And he said, "No, I feel fine." We all know the answer to this. The differential diagnosis of painless jaundice, there really isn't anything good on that answer. What I said was, yeah, you probably need to get that looked into. What I write was, you're already dead. The rest is just details. He made it a few precious months to be home on his ranch and to spend with his daughter until the pancreatic cancer proved my words correct. But what toll does that take when we know but don't say those words? One of my very deeply held moral beliefs is in the importance of honesty. So I went to the Air Force Academy. This is our honor code. We will not lie, steal, or cheat, nor tolerate among us anyone who does. The lie of omission that I commit, weighs very heavily on me. And one of the ways that I try to reconcile that rift is through writing. I saw this gentleman just a few weeks ago. He was 51 years old, came into the emergency room, and he told me, I've got this pain in my back that's kind of now into my stomach. It started about October, and I've lost 40 pounds. The CT scan showed exactly what I expected, an 8-centimeter pancreatic mass. And I had to take that 10 minutes of a patient-physician relationship that I had built, because this is the emergency room, right? And I had to go in there and use that to destroy his life. How much do I harm him by not telling him the entire truth that I know by this? But I don't have the full truth. I can't tell you if that's an adeno or a peanut, or I don't have the pathology. How much do I harm him by saying we're not certain, but this looks really concerning for cancer? Versus grant him the autonomy that he probably deserves so that he can make plans for what promises to be a very short rest of his life. How do we balance that between the brutal honesty that the cynic in emergency medicine, because I always see the worst, wants to say, with not taking away all of his hope? It's a very fine line in medicine that we walk. And so for him, I chose a kind half-truth, somewhere hopefully not too close to ruinous empathy. I told him we're not sure, but it looks really concerning. The oncologist will do more testing. And he asked me, "Doc, is this the kind that kills you right away?" That lie was a lot more charcoal colored. I said, "I don't know, but it doesn't look good." I always hope that I'm wrong when I have to tell patients that, and I tell them that. I tell them I hope they come back in a year and tell them I'm crazy, or tell me that I'm crazy. But what burden does that put on us in trying to decide how much to share when we have to tell those half-truths? So when that happens, I write my brutal honesty, and my mouth tells those shades of gray. Sebastian Younger is a journalist who spent many years covering conflicts in some of the very worst parts of the world as an embedded journalist. And he wrote this book called Tribe. And in it, he talks about the importance of a community in welcoming our soldiers back in preventing and treating PTSD. And his point was, up until Korea, war used to be a very community phenomenon. World War I, World War II, those happened in people's backyards. And so when you spent World War II hiding in the bomb shelters in London, you didn't have to ask what happened in a war. You just knew. The entire community understood that sacrifice. But now that we've decided to fight our wars so far from our borders, it's a very remote thing. Less than 1% of Americans serve in the military, and so most of us have no idea what happens over there. I remember my second deployment. It was in 2013. Do y'all remember the Miley Cyrus thing with the teddy bears and how that was all over the news and that was all anybody could talk about? This was my experience. This is called a ramp ceremony. When we had a US soldier die, when the ambulance would bring the casket to the flight line to load it onto the aircraft, the entire base would turn out. Not a word is spoken. You stood at attention and you saluted as the casket went by. And then everyone faded back into the night. No one heard about the ramp ceremonies we were doing, but everybody knew about that silly starlet. That same alternative reality happens to us in medicine. Nobody understands what happens behind the closed doors of our hospital unless we tell our truths. We all own a piece of medicine in all of its failings and miracles and flaws. And unless we tell our stories, we don't get to share that with anyone. They don't understand what happens in our hospitals. A lot of times people will ask me, what's the craziest thing you've ever seen? And I want to tell them, you actually don't want to know. That story aimed at my deployment was one of the first things that I ever wrote and published. It was this piece. Because here's the thing, nobody actually wants to know the worst thing we see. They want to hear a funny story about a rectal foreign body. But when I tell them the story about the 4-month-old that I had to send to the pediatric surgeon to remove the plastic toy that he'd been sodomized with from his sigmoid, all of a sudden that story's not so funny anymore. When I talk about the heroin addict who was hooked by her pimp and sold as a slave to the drug, that's not the entertainment they were looking for. Those are words that I don't share. I don't tell those stories. But I think it's important to tell them so that the world understands what we see. And the reason I started sharing was after reading this article by that same author. He talks about the moral burden of war and being shared by everyone in this country. You might not have voted for the people in power, but this is our country. We all pay taxes, and we all own a small piece of war. Unless we share our stories, we don't understand that burden, and we can't share it with those soldiers that are there. Same thing in medicine. Unless we tell our stories in medicine, no one knows the burden of the healthcare system that we carry. One of the most surprising parts for me of the sharing has been finding a community. Medicine feels very isolating when we have a bad outcome. The first thing we're told is don't talk about it, don't share anything, because they might get subpoenaed. But that puts that wound in suspended animation. We can't share it or talk about it or decrease its power. Writer David Sedaris said, I feel sorry for people who don't write, because when something bad happens to them, there's nothing they can do about it. When I started writing about my experiences, I was incredibly surprised by how ununique my suffering was. This article has been shared on the internet more than 250,000 times, and I received letters and emails from all over the world saying that the things that I worried about were the same worries that were in their heart. They talked about sharing this with residents and medical students to start a conversation about the burdens that we carry, the patients that we bring home with us. I write because I have to. I write in the middle of the night when I can't sleep, and to get those words out that have that stranglehold on my throat. I write a lot of things that I don't share because they're not ready for the world, because there's a lot of ugliness in my job, and I want to share it. I want to shelter people from that. Same way that I wanted to shelter my family and friends from what I saw and did during my deployments. But if we don't share that, we don't get to share that power either. And in sharing, what I found is community and support and peace and my tribe. One of the most amazing things is how hungry the world is to hear stories from doctors. There are physicians that are writing books. If you're not ready to put out your novel yet, there are writing courses that will teach you how to share. There are some wonderful online ones from Stanford that'll teach you to write books or blog posts. Harvard has a very well-respected medical writing course that's an in-person course for 3 days. It's available for CME. They'll teach you how to write a book, write a memoir, build a podcast. It is an incredible opportunity for medical writing. If you're not ready to write your novel or your blog piece yet, you can try your hand at something like this. There are a few hashtags on Twitter that are absolutely fascinating. This is #ThosWeCarry. So if you aren't ready to even write 1,000 words, try 160 characters. There are all types of places to share your work. The New England Journal has their perspectives piece that looks specifically at patients and the patient-physician relationship. Hectoin International is a journal specifically dedicated to medical humanities. There are online blogs like Kevin MD and Doximity. Medium is another wonderful place that you can self-publish. If the written word is not what you're interested in, there are storytelling formats. The Moth has formats for all types that are short TED-type speeches. Airway events are medical ones, and there's actually an airway event here in Portland I think it's the last Friday of every month for pediatric storytelling. You can also go to thenocturnist.com. They have a podcast for these types of stories. There are so many places to learn how to write well, so many communities out there on Facebook that will be happy to read what you're writing and offer you feedback and encouragement and help you get hooked into these places to share. People want to hear what we say. They want to hear what's happening behind those glass doors. So I encourage you, if you've ever thought about writing, just put something out there and reach out. I'm happy to help connect you with resources. And I think, come on. This has decided not to play. In 1944, there was a very famous study by psychologists Fritz Heider and Catherine Simmel. And they had this little movie that they showed of these little triangles and squares in a box. And they asked people, tell us the story about this. And people come up with this incredible tale of hiding and escape and fear. Even today, if you show them that same story, they tell you that, or the same images, they tell you the same story. But a computer can't do that. With all of their fancy algorithms, they can't come up with a reason why the squares and the circles are in that little box. This is how we keep humans in medicine. How we keep humans in medicine. A computer might be able to take the schistocytes and the murmur and put that together into mechanical valve hemolysis. But it can't tell you the story of the things that were taken away from that patient's life. It can't tell you about the warm walks in the evening wind or that heart beating fast in someone's chest. We have to keep humans in medicine. If we fail that, we continue to fail our patients. We crave meaning in something so simple as squares and boxes on a video screen. How can we not crave that meaning in something so important as the patient-physician relationship? Call it compassion fatigue, burnout, PTSD, a rose by any other name still has sharp thorns. This is why I write, because it helps me have more to go back and have something for the next chart and the next patient that I pick up and help create that meaning so that I'm able to keep coming back for that next shift. Sharing the joy and the laughter and the fear lets us all see the physician and the person behind that stethoscope and hopefully brings us all just a little bit closer together. And I leave you with a few of those short stories again. And I thank you all so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.